From the streets of Dhaka to the steps of Indonesia's parliament, to Nepal's TikTok lit squares, something is shifting. A generation raised on algorithms and group chats is doing what older movements took decades to build. Moving fast, moving loud, and moving without a single leader at the helm. No headquarters, no party lines, just a phone, a post, and millions watching. They're rewriting the rulebook.
In Bangladesh, quota reform protests left over 1,000 dead and brought down a 15-year government. In Indonesia, youth demonstrations over parliamentary perks during a period of austerity forced a president into a live televised climb down. In Nepal, a social media ban backfired so badly it put a 73-year-old, four-time prime minister out of office and a 35-year-old former rapper on his way to leading the country. The common thread isn't just anger, it's a widening gap and power relation between aging political elites and a generation that is online enough to see through it and fed up enough to act.
Welcome to episode 5 of Speakeasy's podcast. I'm Anandita Pathak.
And I am Antara Jain, and today we are asking the question that sits underneath all of these uprisings.
Is social media the new public tool for policy demands? And can digital momentum actually translate into durable, lasting governance reform? Joining us today is Prof. Wu Junjae. He's a distinguished public policy scholar and senior lecturer at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. With an academic career spanning institutions such as the Education University of Hong Kong, Nanyang Technological University, and Singapore University of Technology and Design, he brings deep regional and comparative expertise. A former Harvard Kennedy School Rajawali Fellow, Prof. Jage's work focuses on global cities in Asia, particularly urban governance, policy design, and economic development. So, Prof, let's get into it. Um, Firstly, I would want to ask Bangladesh, Indonesia, Nepal. When you look at these three cases side by side, what do you see is the common thread and where do the stories diverge?
Thanks. When we look at the three countries, I think we can see that there is a lot of public discontent over the perceived inequality, first of all. And you can see that a lot of the protesters were also young people who feel that they had no real place in the establishment in the way that development is taking place, or they perceive that the elites, the policy and political elites, did not have their interests in mind. So we can see a lot of similarities, regardless of whether it is about job quotas, housing allowance, or even a ban on social media. The underarching unhappiness was about inequality, about unequal access to systems, to the economy, to opportunities, to jobs, and even housing. So I think these are some similarities. But as you have seen in the news, the outcomes have been quite different. And this is a lot to do with the different political contexts of the three countries. You see that in Bangladesh, where there is a very strong dominant party, a strong state, the unrest, the political protests did not really amount to any form of political change or reform. And in Indonesia, where you have a more diverse and slightly more fragmented political system, there is space for concessions to be made, for adjustments to be made in response to the requests of the protesters. Now in Nepal, where there has been a lot of political instability and there is some extent of fragility in the political system, we saw that there was deep change and reform in the government.
We just wanted to understand that a lot of these protests were sparked by very specific policy issues like a job quota, a housing allowance, and a social media ban. But underneath that was something deeper: rising inequality, economic frustration, youth locked out of power. What do you think might have been the specific triggers for these finally translating into protests?
Now, with regards to issues related to the economy, there's always a particular threshold. When youth unemployment hits a particular point when people feel that I'm no longer able to find a job, cost of living are going up. So there is a confluence of different factors. Some of these are economic factors beyond our control, such as higher cost of living, economic disruptions. Some of these others have to do with unequal access to opportunities. So when they converge at a certain point in time, when unemployment reaches a critical level, that's when you see the unhappiness spill over into protests. Now, with the social media ban, it is a lot clearer. The minute social media platforms were taken out, you will see people are unhappy, not so much because they can't go on Twitter or Facebook, but really because they're no longer able to access information or to be able to connect with their peers and with each other. So their online social life has been taken away from them, not just a social media platform.
So there's a difference between social media as an indicator of public opinion and social media as a genuine policy tool. Did these movements actually use social media as a tool to shape policy, or are governments and analysts just reading this as an indicator of public mood?
Now, it's important to note that social media means different things for different people. For most governments, we like to think of social media as a barometer of public sentiment. For most governments, we like to think of social media as a barometer for public sentiment. By looking at social media posts, by looking at people's sentiments posted online, we get a sense of what people feel about specific policies, about the political parties in power. But for the protesters in these countries and for many young people, social media is a means to aggregate their views, to mobilize their peers, to rally or lobby for a certain policy or against a certain policy. So I think that for social media, the citizens may think of it as a tool for possibly engendering public change. The public could think of it as a tool for pushing for policy change or advocating for certain issues. For government, they may think of it as a way to engage citizens or to collect and understand public sentiment.
So, Prof, do you think that social media will ultimately like function as a pressure valve, that the youth want to use or the citizens want to use, and let them actually, just vent without producing real structural change?
In most instances, social media does act as a valve for venting public frustration. It lets people express what they want to express. The beauty of social media is that it is very widespread. When somebody expresses a certain frustration with policy, you get others who are connecting to that same frustration and sharing their views. There is also a certain extent of anonymity in social media. There are many people who are willing to share these frustrations online rather than do it in real life, where they may get judged or persecuted in some extreme cases. So it is a very useful valve for letting off some of the steam from among the youth and among citizens in general. But whether it translates to policy change, it depends on whether the government of the day is receptive to these views. And some governments, they engage the social media protesters, or they engage the youth on social media even without protests going on. So in those cases, you might see policies being adjusted, adapted. But if the policy regime is very resistant towards these views, you may see some pushback against calls for policy reform.
Right.
So one of the events, that particularly that we wanted to understand was Nepal's September 2025 uprising. It produced one of the most extraordinary moments in recent democratic history, where we saw that thousands of young people actually gathered on Discord, which is, I think, a gaming platform, to debate and ultimately select their interim prime minister. In what many called an unprecedented act of digital democracy now. But participants in this movement also cautioned against the narrative that the PM was chosen solely through Discord. And what does that mean? What does movement actually represent? A genuine expansion of democratic legitimacy, a fascinating anomaly, or something more fragile than the headlines suggested?
I think the case of Nepal is a very interesting case study of citizens wanting to use an online platform to express their views, to express their preference for a new prime minister, a new political leader. And this happened because in Nepal, there was a systemic loss of trust in public institutions, which includes the institution of elections, the political institution. Now, these online platforms can be useful when political institutions fall apart or the public loses complete trust in these institutions. But we should caution against having these platforms thinking of them as a viable alternative, because political institutions remain the most effective way of electing new governments. The electoral process remains the most transparent way of doing so. Now, these platforms should only be used if the regular political institutions have fallen apart, have decayed to an extent where they are no longer functional. Now, there is a danger of using these online platforms because, as we know, most social media platforms can create echo chambers. Not everyone is tapped into Discord. Not everyone is able to use Discord or know how to use it. So you exclude portions of society that may not agree with those voices on Discord. So you get a little bit of a bubble going on. So there is a risk. In this case, you may have generated good political reform.
Right.
In some other instance, you may create politicians who are a bit maybe one-sided, who may be a bit more populist in nature. So it's a little bit of the risk going on.
Yes, I think that's definitely something that we need to take note of now that social media is actually coming into the policy space and almost possible of making some sort of structural change, but we should not go to the bane side of it and just maybe use to its best utility.
That's right.
Moving forward,
So, Prof, we just wanted to understand if you were, for example, advising today's youth, what would you specifically tell them about making sure digital momentum doesn't really fizzle out once the hashtag stops trending?
So we should remember that this digital momentum, if nothing else is done beyond the space of the online space, it will fizzle out. Because real advocacy, real social movements should translate to the real world as well. Beyond online campaigns, there's a need to build up public support at the ground level. Now, without that grassroots support, there's no way for the digital momentum to translate into any kind of a policy change or any kind of a policy advocacy. So, in short, the real world still matters a lot, while the digital tools can be a very powerful accelerator for expanding or for championing your social causes. We see that happening a lot in the sustainability space. A lot of youth advocacy for sustainability,
depending on like
combine that with real youth movements on the ground, and that's a very powerful movement going on.
so I think that's definitely something we are learning today, that how do we kind of go ahead and use social media for the best, because there is a lot, I feel sometimes, even like for example taking into consideration something like COVID, and I've seen how the youth have utilized social media to advocate for causes, something like a bill which they want to reject, or want to discuss, show their dissent for. They've used social media campaigns. I mean, I think Twitter and Instagram have been particularly popular in showing that at a time when you can't step out of your houses. So that's something definitely that we would carry forward, that social media actually is now becoming a public policy space for people to discuss and move policy changes forward. Thank you for being with us here today, Prof. We're definitely like enriched with the discussion that we have today. We really wanted to understand these. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank
Yeah,
you for
thank you
having
so
me.
much, Prof.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode 5 of the Speakeasy podcast. We will see you next season.